camera, so I can just concentrate on one camera. You're all very welcome here tonight. My name is Michael Doyle. I'm the Vice Chair, and this Southsider has asked this Northsider to say a few words, and if I get sick during this, just excuse the intro. But however, from a point of view of I as an outsider, and I'm sure Paul as an outsider, or blow-ins as we might call it, tonight's talk, to me, in any case, from my personal point of view, it's very much welcomed, because from the point of view of those who are not from the area, as I say, but who have come to Birmingham, or I was going to say Birmingham, who have come to Blessington, and I would call it Blessington of the Lakes, if you can excuse that sort of almost Arthurian expression about the lakes. You've come to know it as a great place to come, and Dublin has a big association about lakes, especially from the south side of the city. But however, it's also an ideal opportunity for this presentation for those of you who may still have, or have had relatives that have come from the affected areas, which was Balmahound and the surrounding valley and townlands. And in that regard, a few months back, I was up in Ballymount, and I noticed this garden dedicated to the townlands that were flooded. And in this granite display in the garden, fantastic piece, on it is all the townlands that were duly affected by this flooding, or this deluge that was visited upon these people. And in that respect, all the percentages are there. And it's a very good statistical reminder, but it's a statistic that points to fact. And that fact is in relation to dislocation of people from their homes. And in that regard, is that dislocation, for me, is a perfect example of what we are experiencing now worldwide, and what this country is taking in relation to refugees, neighbours from our world society coming into this society, and they're disenfranchised, and they are dehoused, and they're sent here. And we have this. And this is what happened on a much smaller level, a much smaller degree, but no less traumatic on these people who had to be taken out and forced out of their lands. So from that point of view, it is essential that not only yourselves who have had this relationship, but also us who have come in here, who haven't had that experience, but if we are involved with history, we have to know about such things. And just bear with me a sec. As regards to newcomers, we're given a chance for the people, to see the people, to hear about the people, the villagers, these actual human beings who suffered this loss of a home. And I'm reminded of the poem by R.W. Service, an English minor poet, but a home and all that it means, from a fireside far from the cares that are, four walls and a roof above, and crowned with a woman's love, all the ladies, and a woman dearer than all the world, and true as heaven is true. So these are essentially, what I'm pointing out is that these were families and homes and individuals that were just taken out. And I'm sure this is what Paul is going to emphasise here tonight. Is this displacement, of course, of people around the world that we are experiencing, as I say, and for those who have had relatives here in this area, and it was in fact a deluge. We read about Noah, etc., and the rains, etc., but this was a deluge visited upon them. And this is what we were here tonight. So, in this small interval of time that we're allowed here, 2 hours or so, or as long as you can put with your man talking in any case, it's an opportunity to display respectful remembrance to former neighbours and this dismantled social group who played out their living story in the valley. And it's a story is that I'm reminded of the French word for story is histoire, which essentially would be history. And that's what we're about tonight. It's not just a history of facts and figures, it's about a story that happened, and it happened some time ago, but it have to be remembered. And a remembrance for us, and I think so, is very important, because we cannot afford individually or collectively not recall the living experiences and existences that we once lost beforehand. And if we don't remember those things, then we won't be able to move forward as a general principle. If you don't remember, how can you move forward? And in any case, for me, essentially, is to live without remembrances is just to exist without direction. So with that, I'll hand you over to Colin.
Yeah, thanks very much. We must have went to school on the south side. Good, very good speech, but yes, but there is a level of emotion attached to this particular presentation, right? But I'm not going to try and wind it up, right? Because I'm going to present facts, right? And I will make certain statements, which in fact, we'll try to calm it down, because there are people here who know, and there are people here who are aware of what the effect has had. And Mick has mentioned some of them there as part of what it's about. But let's get on with it now, right? It's called Blessington Lakes, the flooding of the upper Liffey Valley and the extinction of the townland of Ballynahound. Now, just before we go any further, townland, right? Okay? It's called sometimes a village, Ballynahound village. But really, it's not a village, because I think a village is defined by the fact that it has a post box and it has probably a pub, right? And in Ballynahound, there was nothing of that nature. So it's really a townland, as the others are around the lake itself. So I refer to it all the time. Now, having said that, I've used this as a source, which is, of course, beneath the Coolafuga Reservoir, right? And it's edited by Chris Cornett, who is, in fact, himself an expert in this area. And he refers to it as a village, right? But a local person said to me, in fact, it was never a village, it was always a townland. So we can have that debate another time, right? So let's move on from there, right? You have the context in which, in fact, we're trying to deal with this as he goes here. Have a look at it. Now, the Liffey Reservoir Scheme, that's what it was called, right? Okay? And I'll come back to that now in a second. And the purpose was to supply water to Dublin City, because Dublin was growing as an urban centre, and as a consequence, the amount of water that was needed was just not sufficient that was there. So that was one possibility. The other thing was to provide additional electricity supply to the national grid, right? And that's evident by the fact of the number of power generating stations that come off that, right? In terms of looking at, say, Coolafuga and going on down to the falls, right? And further on down to Dardistown. That's where, in fact, the water was going. Now, what was the action? The action was it submerged the following historic landscape, right? Now, a lot of people here probably do not remember the landscape, but can you imagine what it may have been like in terms of it being a valley with the mountains on either side, right? Also, historic was it thriving farming communities within the upper Liffey Valley. That was a very important area. We'll come back to that at a time again. Complete loss of the townland of Ballynahound. Most unusual, because there's no other townland. All right, Sally, go ahead. Anybody else coming in? Yeah. Oh yeah, come in. Right. Okay. So the complete loss of the town of Ballynahound and some substantial parts of the townlands, of the other townlands in the upper Liffey Valley were affected by the flooding. And we'll see that as part of what we're demonstrating as we go through it. Now, the consequence of the flooding. 5,500 acres of land were submerged. Now that's not a small area if you think about it, right? 5,500. That's the figure given in all the books. There was 50... Oh, Tim, go ahead, come on yourself. There's chocolate seats down there, I think, Tim. Yeah. There were 50 farms submerged. And there were 76 family houses lost. There were 12 farm labourers' cottages. There was a cemetery which went. There was a Killock bog which went. There were 3 bridges and several miles of road. Now that's a fairly consequential effect of, in fact, flooding a valley, right? And you can see, in fact, you can think about the widespread effect it had on the people who lived in it. But there are the details of what happened in terms of when the water was beginning to be let out. We'll come back to that again. Now here you have it, right? The one here, my walking cane, my Charlie Chaplin walking cane, right? What you have here, you have the Liffey coming down, and you have the King's River coming down. And they both join just in around the idea of the Balti Boys. And then it moves on down towards Coolafuga. So that's how it came together as part of how the actual the valley was actually flooded, right? Now this here is in fact Ballinahell, but we'll come back to that now in a second. And as you can see, I haven't wiped out completely because it was completely submerged as part of it. All the other townlands around were affected, but not as much. Flooding of the upper valley. And what did it affect? It affected communities around the actual valley, the upper Liffey Valley. It affected farming. It affected landscape and bridges. It affected religious practices. It affected tourism, natural resources, and of course, the thorn in the actual lion's foot is in fact compensation. And I'll leave that to last because that can be quite emotive. We'll come back to that now shortly. But these are the things that were affected by the actual flooding of the upper Liffey Valley, right? And what towns were affected? What townlands were affected? Ballyboys, Ballyloughlin, Borgish, Humphreys-Town, Lacken, Monmouth. Everybody know where Monmouth is, do they? Vallymount, right? Right? Vallymount. Russellstown, Ballinahell submerged completely, and a total of 5,500 acres flooded. That is the effect the flooding had on the actual townlands in the upper Liffey Valley itself. Ballinahell, townland and community, right? Now, where is it? It's located in the centre of the upper Liffey Valley. The townland of Ballinahell was submerged completely. Now that's an unusual thing. As I say, around the other townlands, they were all affected, but none of them were actually submerged completely. And that meant, in fact, and I'll show you a picture of that, I'll show you a map of this now in a second, right? The only townland to be flooded completely, there were 76 houses in the upper Liffey Valley were lost to the flooding, I've already mentioned that. 12 labour cottages, and all towns, as mentioned, were affected by the flood waters, okay? So straight away you're thinking, you know, this is how the disasters affected the community. And it really did, right? And we need to explore some of those effects by looking at that, right? Now here is the Ballinahell townland, right? And it's interesting that you have a look at this. It doesn't have a large number of people. There is in fact John Quinn, and John Quinn is the major man within the actual townland itself, right? There's no post office, there's no pub, there's no church, right? So it is a townland, even though it's called a village. But that's what was lost when in fact the water came, and that's what was submerged completely as part of the flooding of the upper Liffey Valley. Now, here is in fact some of the actual pictures of the townland. And as you can see, it was fairly substantial, because we go back there, we can see in fact shed, barn, cow shed, and so on. Lots of pieces of buildings for the purpose of farming, and the amount of farming that went on. Going back here are in fact some of the buildings themselves. And they were quite substantial. You know, when you look around and look through it, and you'll see here in fact, these are all little cottages. Now as you can see, the actual cottages themselves were straw. This one here appears to be a slate roof, right? Again, a slate roof possibly, and here you have in fact straw. But this is where this is where the Quins were living at the time, right? As part of it. And I'm focusing on that because of the fact that that's the one that was completely submerged, and that's the one in fact was completely affected by the actual flooding of the valley itself. And this is where it's important to remember, you know, they're not only buildings. Here we have children. Here we have a bicycle. Here we have a home. Mick mentioned that earlier. This is not only a building, it's also a home where people have been reared for centuries. And in fact, children are now currently reared there. And that's Joe Quinn's house in Ballinahell, right? And you get to get a sense of, you get a feeling now, well, I got a sense of feeling when I was dealing with this, that this really was a little bit of a tragic situation. That these people now are being told to go. We'll come back to why. This is Biddy Highland, Borgish Moyle, which would be down around where the actual Liffey met up with the King's River coming through. And that's where there. Now, I like about this, well, first and foremost, there's a slate roof, and there is, of course, a straw thing, right? But she brought me back to my mother, right? when I looked at this, because she's wearing what's called a smock. A smock. Now, a lot of people here, young people here, may not know what a smock is, right? They talk about an apron, right? But a smock is something that went over your head and covered every part of your body in terms of the cooking that needs to be done. So this lady, in fact, is of our generation. This is her house, Biddy Island, and that's one that was lost under the lake as well. And again, part of a community, right? Not only do we have children, we have adults here. There's a child there held by our granny probably, I would imagine, right? And here's the Twyford family, the last day outside the house. Now, looking at the number of people that were there, right? Now, they were not from Ballynahown, they were from other parts of the valley itself, right? And when we look at the fact that, or think about the fact that there were 76 houses that were in fact submerged, right? Now, at the time, we were a good Catholic country. And I would say, on average, there had to be somewhere between 5, maybe 6 to 8 children in each of those families. Now, this is an assumption on my behalf, right? But if you multiply even 5 by 76, and look at the number of people that have been displaced arising from the actual flooding. And there's one family there that has been, now I'm sure that's an extended family, you know, the central family, there's granny in the middle there, these are probably grandchildren, there's aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters and so on. But that's one family that was actually completely displaced arising from the flooding of the valley. So what I'm coming at all the time is the fact that not only were the buildings affected, right, and they were wiped out, but the actual people who lived in the buildings were affected, and they had to go. And here's the Bourne family of Baldyboys, right? The Bourne family of Baldyboys with the boarding leading to the stepping stones at Ballynahown in the background. That's this here, right? Now, if they're, I think they are the same Bournes that live down by Borgage. Is that correct? Yes, I'm correct, right? What was the man's name? Dick Bourne, that's right. Now, myself and Jim had occasion to go down before Dick passed, right? To sit and chat with him about the whole thing. And he said, in fact, that, you know, where the house was. Now, Jim and I went and found the house, right? And the house was in ruins, but it was outside the barrier of the actual lake itself. So he should never have had to move, but he was moved, right? But there was even a sadder part to it than that. He said, in fact, that when he was moved, he got back, he and his son, or whoever the case was, he went back to take the slates off the roof, right? And what happened? He got an invoice from the ESB saying you have to pay them. Because the contract said, in fact, that when the ESB, right, purchased the goods, purchased the houses, and it was CPO'd, right, they bought everything that was in the house, on the house, and throughout the house. So therefore, what happened, in fact, some people went back, and the boards were one of them, and I'm sure others did, because in one instance, the ESB are complaining to Wicklow County Council and saying, we had a contract whereby, in fact, we bought the houses and we got everything in them, right? We've been to 2 houses now, the fireplace are missing. This is missing, that's missing, the slates are gone, right? And of course, the ESB were looking to sort of renegotiate the contract. I was going to say good luck with that, but I don't know what happened in the end. But as you can see, you know, it wasn't a case of people leaving and forgetting. It was a case of people trying to bring stuff with them, which was part of their house, in terms of their living and the community in which they were part of. So there's the Boards family. Now, if you go out the road towards Valleymount, right, now there's a turn for Baldyboy Cemetery, right? And on the left, to the left of that, there's another turn, which brings you down to the lake. And that there is that particular road there, right? Here's the Clark and Quinn children. And again, now we've had children, we've had adults, right? We've had aunts and uncles and so on. These are the people who were affected by the actual flooding of the lake itself. And that sort of, I think, strings the heart of, you know, the heartstrings in relation to recognising that it was not a case of just get the water in and get the people out. It was more than that, right? And then here we have the cooking area, and these photographs are out of this particular book here, right? And as you can see, I'm sure some of you may have experienced some of these as part of being, you know, in terms of your age group, families or grandfathers or grannies, right? And this is where they went over the actual fire itself, there's your kettle, right? And a big huge fireplace now, that is some piece of timber there, sort of supporting the roof over the thing itself. But that's one of the interiors of the house. And I'm sure some of that stuff was taken as part of it. And this, of course, is in fact the dining area. And as I often said to my wife, I says, the Delph. And she say, what are you talking about, the Delph? I says, there's the Delph. Oh no, she said, that's cups and saucers. But there isn't no meaning, you know. Delph was one of the phrases that was used. And of course, this was a pride of place in the house because it displayed the actual type of materials they had gathered up, right? And it was a sign of status in some manner, shape or form. When people walked into us, today would be, well not today, but maybe a little while back, would be the china cabinet, right? When you walk into the house, you see the china cabinet, there's a bit of silver there, and there's a bit of Wedgwood this, a little bit of Waterford glass and so on. And all of a sudden you realise, there's a few pounds here, you know? And the same thing might be in here, right? That this is one of the interiors of the house. And you can guarantee that one of these things, maybe in terms of the Delph, that would have went with them anyway. But maybe the dresser went eventually, and this went eventually. So the kitchen and dining area. So we have in fact the actual cooking area with the kitchen and dining area, this representing the actual type of family that was there. And again, adding to the sense of the loss that was going to occur arising from the flooding of the lake itself, or the flooding of the valley itself. And here you have another farm, right? Now, if I'm not mistaken, there's a settled bed there somewhere, right? And for the younger people, maybe I'm one of those people, I didn't ever know where the settled bed was, right? A settled bed was a bed beside the fire, right? And I think it was used for people who in fact came in as guests or had stayed overnight, right? And it probably was one of the most warmest beds in the area, a settled bed. Now I think it might be on this side here the settled bed is, right? Because that looks like a seat. But this here would be a settled bed. So again, not unlike the actual previous one I showed you. But again, showing you that, you know, this was a living, breathing community of adults, children, animals, farmlands as part of what was going on, right? And here's a fine house, right? Now, we call that a cottage until one of our members told us that's not a cottage, that's a house. Which it is, of course, right? And as you can see, it's a fine house. So the house of Ballinaham, which of course is gone as well, right? So again, you're getting a sense, I hope, of what has been lost by dint of the water and the floods coming in terms of the community that were there, in terms of the buildings that were there, in terms of possessions that were there, right? And what that all meant to those people. Because these are people who lived in these areas, not only in Ballinaham, but in the townlands around, and lived there for generations of people. And one of the concerns was, in fact, and I'll come back to this again, was the idea of defining the land, you know? And, you know, a CPO is a compulsive purchase order, and the actual ESB were granted that facility. So therefore, when they were looking to buy the land, they said, can we have a look at the deeds? Good luck with that, you know? Deeds. The man says, see that rock over there? And you see that bush over there? And that stream there? That defines my land. And of course, that was the case. Because they had markers in terms of the different areas that determined the land they owned. And that was respected throughout the community itself. And that was one of the problems which it came to when it came to compensation. But we'll come back to that as well, right? And I just put this in. This is Paddy Clark, the bridge at Ballinaham, right? Okay, it's a famous photograph, right? And as they say in Newbridge, it's a donkey, whereas in Blessington they say donkeys. You know, there's donkeys in the sun.
That's my uncle.
Is that your uncle? Excellent, right? Paddy Clark. Oh, did he live in Ballinaham?
Yeah.
Your grandmother, right?
John, there was 8 of them.
Right.
Johnny was my father.
Well, you just confirmed to me, in fact, 8 as being a family figure, right? Which I would have expected to be around 6 and 8 to a family, good Catholic children, right? Because the priest was going around wanting to know, how come you only got 2 children? You know, is there something wrong here? Are you using something? right? And there was all of that sort of little bit of witch hunting going on as part of the society at the time. And we must not sort of ignore that or sort of say, in fact, it was the case, because the church had a real stranglehold on the actual society itself. So this is Paddy Clark, and we have our relatives here, right, which is great. We've confirmed that, in fact, the family could be around 6 to 8 people, right? Farming in the Upper Liffey Valley, farming, right? Now, this is very contentious in the sense in which, in fact, we said, in fact, that there were 76 farms lost, right? Now, that wasn't only in terms of Ballynahown, because you know about Ballynahown, I showed you the map of that, right? That was really one farm belonging to the Quins, right? But the farms that were lost right around the other townlands, and I've mentioned a number of the towns where that was lost themselves, right? Now, what is a farm? Oh, for a Dubliner, that's where you have cows and you have sheep and so that's what you have, look, you know, nothing else, you know. But of course, farms in the rural areas is a way of living, right? And not only a way of living, but they're tied into, people who own it are tied into the land, right? There's an emotional attachment to the idea of having that farm. And taking that away is like taking, quote unquote, a child away. Because I do remember a good while back when the cow disease, what was it? Foot and mouth, right? And I remember actually seeing pictures in England where in fact they were born in the carcasses, and this man was trying to explain, he broke down. So, as you can see, farming is more than just the idea of looking after cattle, looking after sheep, and it was primarily cattle, right, that they looked after. So here we have, these are the farm labourers in Russellstown estate, right? And as you can see, healthy individuals. I'm not too sure, this is a mallet, I believe, for the purpose of putting posts, I think, that's what it's about. And there was one out there, I think, in the, out in Lacken, do you know the, what's out in that? Where you go get the horseshoe. Farrier, right there. There was one there, and I saw a mallet, not that size, but somewhere of that nature, right? So here, in fact, is some farmers who are farm labourers, right? And they would have lost work because of the fact that the farms were gone, right? And here is, in fact, another thing, collecting turf from the Killock Bog, right? Now, I need to go back a little bit in terms of the farms, right? Because there was what's called under the road and over the road, right? Because the roads sort of went around the valley itself, and you could have 60 acres, and 30 could be under the road and 30 could be above the road. And if in fact the 30 under the road was flooded, you were done. You hadn't got them right. The thing in fact is, the 30 under the road were usually the best land because that's where they did the grazing for the cattle. They sent the cattle on down there because the other 30 were up the hill, right? And that changed the focus. Somebody left with 30 acres found in fact that it wasn't viable, right? And we'll come back to why they left as part of that in a few minutes. But the point I'm making here is in fact that the actual farms were split and people were left with farms which were unviable in terms of providing a living for the family itself, because they were really scratching out a living as part of what they were doing anyway. Because I mean, farming is hard work. If you ever look at it, I'm sure people who are here farmers will know exactly how hard it is, right? And having looked at some of the farming programs over the years, I realise in fact it's from 6 o'clock in the morning right through to 10 o'clock at night, depending on what you're doing and where you're doing it, right? But in terms of the farms, right, and the splitting of the farms, and the fact that the people now didn't have the grazing land down the lower end because of the fact that the land had been flooded, it meant in fact that where were they going to put the cattle? Problem was in fact they couldn't put them anywhere. And some of them had to think about the idea of changing their farming, which is in fact they had to go to sheep farming, because the upper land was more suitable for the purpose of sheep farming. So again, you're seeing the effect this idea of the flooding is having on not only the communities, right, and what we've talked about, not only but also the farming. But this is important here. There was a big bog called the Killock Bog, right? It was really more towards Ballyknocken, right? And the owner of the bog was well compensated for the actual bog when in fact it was flooded. But the people who lived around the area where this became the main source of fuel, right, were not compensated. Their whole social or economic existence was affected by the fact that you could not now harvest any turf. And it's been shown, in fact, through some of the research, that as the water started to rise, right, and you can imagine it probably rose from Pulafuka, coming back up towards Lacken, Ballyknocken and so on. And with the actual bog at the Ballyknocken end, it was shown, in fact, and it has been reported, that they were out there at 6 in the morning and they stayed till 10 o'clock at night trying to harvest the actual bog for the purpose, so that as the water was coming up towards them, right? Because they wanted to save as much turf as possible, because coal itself would have been fiercely expensive. And this was the main source of heat within the family itself. So therefore that was lost. That's a social effect on the community. And then of course we have here harvesting crops, right? I mean, there was lots of crops there, a lot of stuff being grown in the actual upper valley. And here are people who were, in fact, that's a fairly sophisticated piece of work as far as I can see, but they would have been harvesting, and I'm not too sure what they were harvesting. But the point being, in fact, is that the bogs were not there anymore, right? The cattle were being affected because they couldn't graze. And then, of course, the actual harvesting couldn't take place, because again, the farms were, in fact, being obliterated. And here you have John Baker, John the Baker Quinn, right? And he's churning at this stage here, butter. It's actually, I don't think it's butter he's churning. He's probably grinding grain, right, as part of wheat and making bread and so on. Now, that points, again, take the bog, take the cattle, take this here. That points to a level of self-sufficiency which these people had going as part of their lives. And now, in fact, that was all going to be taken away, not only in terms of the community, but in terms of their living conditions themselves. And here's the evidence of what was going on in the town itself, because this is market day, as you're probably aware. You may have seen this photograph many times off. It's taken from the steeple of the St. Mary's Church, right? And it's looking back down the town. This here is the Ulster Bank, right? And of course, this is a famous tram, Dublin and Blessington steam tram, which we had an exhibition on quite recently, right? And as you can see, in fact, you have sheep, mainly sheep there, right? But I believe there's horses as well, because I have pictures of horses and of cattle, right? So a fair day. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't happen now, because you have J.P. Doyle up around the top of the town, and they sell cattle on, well, sheep on a Tuesday and cattle on a Thursday, right? But this is the way it was at that time. And I don't know, J.P. Doyle didn't come in here until the 50s, right? So this market was in fact being wiped out by dint of the fact that people around the area didn't have, and well, I won't say they didn't have, but they were affected by the flooding of the lake because of the fact that their farming traditions were being affected itself. The Upper Liffey Valley, landscape and bridges, right? So we looked at communities, we looked at the farming, we see how it's affected the communities, we see how it affected the farming, right? How did it affect the landscape? Well, believe it or believe it not, this here, right? It says, the junction of the River Liffey and the King's River, looking from Ballyboys. So therefore, this here is in fact the King's River coming down. This here is in fact the Liffey coming down. They're both joining, and of course they turn into the Liffey. We were never going to turn it into the King's River, were we? We're never going to go through Dublin and anywhere else called the King's River. They called it the Liffey, even though this was a bigger river, I believe, at the time, in terms of the Liffey itself. So it was called the Liffey. This Liffey goes on. So that's the junction there. And I showed you that junction way back on the map, where the Liffey was coming in, the King's River was coming in, and how they join. And this is where they join. And that's around where, do you know what's Elizabeth Smith's house is, Ballyboy's house. Yeah, just on that bend, right? That's where, in fact, they link up. Now, I couldn't point to the spot, right? But having said that, it's in that particular vicinity. And it's what's called Burgage Moyle, the area is, right? And that's where they joined up, right? This here is the Burgage Bridge and the River Liffey, right? And this here is Liffey coming down. Now this Burgage Bridge, right, where is that? Well, if you go down to Burgage and down towards the cemetery, and go on down to the tower, the Burgage Tower, right, the bridge went across there. That's the bridge there, went across. And in here would have been, in fact, Baldyboy's house, right? Now that has been replaced. And it's been replaced by, well, there's the bridge there, right, coming across. This here is the one that has replaced it. And we all know that one, right? Because you take the turn off the N81, you come right down here, and there is, in fact, the rest of the road all out. But the Burgage Bridge, which is this one here, right, is that one there, right? Now, I just realised I put it as a straight line. So much for the straight line, I think it was, right? There's the bridge that was gone, right? Okay? Then, of course, we have here, in fact, the Blessington Bridge, right? And in the foreground, or the background, whichever you call it, right? This is the building of the new bridge, which is the bridge you go over every day, right? And this is the bridge, well, it's over the River Liffey, because this is the River Liffey before it meets up with the King's River. And this here is the mill, right? And the mill again was a corn mill, right? And again, they were blown up. This was blown up, right? And the idea was, in fact, to destroy all of these, so that, in fact, they couldn't be used or something could be done with them. You never know what people want to be doing. You never know what the thinking was, right? I'm not being somebody of that nature. I can't imagine what people would do. But having said that, somebody believed, in fact, they could do more. So they blew the whole thing up. This here is, in fact, Ballymount Bridge, right? That's the current Ballymount Bridge. This here is the bridge that was called Humphreys-Town Bridge, right? That is the Humphreys-Town Bridge that went that way, and it would go over towards the Sailing Club. That's my understanding in terms of the geography of the town, of the place itself. But this is the new bridge going into Ballymount. So we've had Burgage Bridge, Blessington Bridge, and then we have Humphreys-Town Bridge, all gone. Now, new bridges in their place, right? And the bridges are under the control of the ESB, right? There's another question about that, but we won't go into that now at this stage, right? So there's 3 bridges that have been moved, right? Because the landscape has been affected by the flooding of the river itself. And of course, some of those bridges were old bridges. And they were only for a particular sort of type of transport, right? We're now moving into the 20th century, the earlier part of the 20th century, and we've got the development of transport, right? And those bridges would not have been adequate for the purpose of transporting things across. So there was a necessity in one manner, shape or form. Having said that, if they didn't do the dam or didn't do the lake, then there may not have been a necessity. But again, the landscape has been affected by, and these are the bridges that have been affected by it. This is Russellstown House. For those who are not too sure about that is, if you go down the N81 and there's a turn in for Rusbury, just before that there's a turn to the left, which brings you into Russellstown Car Park, right? And just further on, if you go out, Russellstown House, which is this one here, right, is way below the lake itself. And there are bits and pieces, I'm sure, of it still around. But they've stripped everything out there, and there's a couple of children and an adult. I don't know whether they're taking something or just taking a picture, you know. But that's the house that was there. It's a fine house as well. Because who are the people who live in it, John? The Hornages, right? And the Hornages were the ones who owned it till Farris, right?
No, they were related.
Yeah, well, it's not the same Hornages, but they were over the Hornages up till Farris, right? And beside this, there is a small lane. Jim always tells you the name of this one. Featherbed Lane, right? And just beyond the turn in for Russellstown Car Park, there's a Featherbed Lane, right? In that Featherbed Lane, there's a gate opposite that, where in fact the lady of Russellstown would come out, go up onto Featherbed Lane, and then over to the actual Tulfarris itself, or over to see Miss Smith, Elizabeth Smith, right? There was in fact a way of getting across there. But that's another day's work, right? So, religious practices, right? And you're wondering, how could that be inherited? But you'd be surprised. Because first and foremost, this is the old cemetery, right? This is a picture taken by one of the ladies, and these are some of the crosses that are in fact were there, right, as part of it. And here is in fact the layout of the cemetery, right? The cemetery is laid out, and here is in fact Gordon's Tower, right? And the figure here is 849. So there's 849 graves in that particular cemetery itself. And that's called Borgate Cemetery. If you go down there now, you'll see the tower has been somewhat preserved. That was arising from a small group of people, ourselves included, who got behind the idea of asking the ESB to do something. It took 70 years to get them to do it, right? But that's another day's work. Because the tower was in good condition back in the 30s, right? And what's left of it is in fact two walls, right? With one or two pieces. So they've preserved it. It couldn't be reconstructed, it just be preserved itself, right? And there's a plan, we're hoping there's a plan around that. But this here is the Borgate Tower. And here is in fact the cemetery itself. 849. And where are all those people gone? And the reason why they had to move those people was the fear of the fact that the water would come up, right? And when it comes up, of course, it would invade the cemetery. And then you have, in fact, pollution, right? This was drinking water for the people of Dublin, right? I say that now snidely, but the thing, in fact, is it could not be allowed to be there. And the same thing with the act, when they flooded the lake, they put 35 miles of fencing around the lake so that the cattle couldn't come down and soil the lake by whatever way they do it. And they put trees in, right? So the ESB was in fact making sure that that water was going to be as pure as it possibly could be, with no effluent coming from any other manner, shape or form. But that there is Yosemite 849. Now where did it go? It went there. This is in fact the new Borgate Cemetery, right? And you're probably very familiar with it. If you haven't been in it a couple of times, you probably know it. And as you go in the gate on the left-hand side is in fact nearly all the old burials, right? Now I won't say I've counted them, but I'm telling you now it's not 849, right?
Thank you very much, sir. Really appreciate your time.
You look after
I have to
yourself.
go, okay?
No problem, Chairman. Keep safe.
And you have a good shower.
Thank you. First time I've ever had that happening. That's nice. Anyway, there's not 849. And there's always been a suspicion that they never got all of the remains from the actual cemetery, original cemetery itself. And so be it, you know. I mean, it was going to, well, it could be contradicted, but nobody can prove it, right? But this is the new cemetery. So this is the new area. So all of the old, well, the headstones are down here, and this is the new part of the cemetery. And as you walk in, you'll see this here. Down at the actual old cemetery, well, there was in fact St. Mark's Cross and a 13th century grave slab, right? So as you walk into the actual gate that I showed you there, that gate there, right? That particular piece is just inside it. And it tells you about St. Mark's Cross. That's the big cross, which is actually in the cemetery on the left-hand side. And it was known as St. Bwytein's Cross, but also referred to as St. Mark's. And then the grave slab, right, is in fact 13th century. So that gives you a sense of the time in which in fact this place was operating. Because in terms of going back a bit, right, to here, where am I going back to? Yeah, here, which is that one there, the tower, right? There was a church in that, right? And they've actually dated the whole thing to around maybe the 13th, 14th century, right? So this is a historic site. And if you walk through that, which you can do today, right, because they have a cross commemorating the fact that there was a cemetery or something of a sacred nature there. And the sacred nature is, of course, the actual cemetery itself. But as you go along the walk, which brings you out onto the N81, there was a small, prehistoric, cyst found. It's now reconstructed and it's in the National Museum, right? So here we have that. Then we have this here, indicating Borgate Cemetery, St. Mark's Cross to the left, and all of these two things were in fact in the actual old cemetery itself. So again, you know, the history of the place has been affected, right, by the flooding of the lake. Now, there is the overarching thing, and I don't want to sort of keep harping on that. The overarching thing is, in fact, there was the greater good, right, or the personal good or the private good of individuals was sacrificed to the greater good. And that's not an unusual way for governments to go, right? There is a sense in which, in fact, they say the greater good is better than the private good. But ask the people who are affected by it and see what they think about it, right? And that's another thing we come to now in a few minutes, right? This is, in fact, St. Bowden's Well, right? And St. Bowden's Well, of course, had curative properties, where you could go, and it's been said, that people have gone there with crutches and came back and left the crutches there, right? Now, I don't know what the full extent of what they could cure, right? But there was obviously curative properties, and people went to that. We have, of course, in the town, we have St. Patrick's Well. You know what that is? It's just down the Kilbride Road, and just beyond what was formerly Dr. Joyce's house, right? The original road going down, right, to the mill and the Burgess Bridge. There's a St. Patrick's Well there. Supposed to be very good for toothaches, right? And I'm sure other things, in fact, but I'm not too sure. But if you go down there any day, you'll see what's called patterns. People hanging things on it. They'll hang a piece of cloth, they will hang rosary beads. They've been down there, right? And they've been praying as part of whatever the belief is, right? And it's very interesting about the wells of Ireland, right? I mean, when you think about the fact that Ireland was a very pagan country, and out came St. Patrick, right? Well, Patrick was as cute as a fox, right? He didn't denounce the pagan wells, he just renamed them, right? St. Bridget's Well, St. Patrick's Well, St. So-and-so's Well, right? It says, okay, whatever properties it has, a pagan, it still has, but then now they're Saint Will, Saint this. And it had to be a transference from paganism to Catholicism without any bloodshed whatsoever, right? But this is the well here in St. Bowden's Well. Now that apparently was available in 1978, I think, for those who may remember, the water went down, right? And when it went down, in fact, some of the remains of houses and St. Bowden's Well were exposed, right? And Gabriel says it's like going back in time in a picture of the actual place itself. And of course, we all know what this is. This is the May procession, right? I don't know if anybody was part and parcel of May processions, right? I was anyway, and I still have my surplice, right? I guarantee it doesn't fit me, but that's neither here nor there, right? You walk around in May, right? Around the area where you lived, right? And this is all dedicated to Mary, right? And this is the May procession, right? Bowden's Well May procession, 1929, right? Before the flooding of the lake. And as you can see, people could walk out through it. And there's the beautiful mountains on either side, right? This is the upper Liffey Valley. Poulafuka waterfall. Tourism, right? Now I'm going to mention this because this was a beautiful scene, which in fact people from all parts of the Dublin area and the Blessington area came to. And you had the Dublin and Blessington steam tram, which people picked up in Tyrrell, and they came out then to the waterfall. As part of the vision of that, you've heard of, what's the one in Leitrim, Jim? The waterfalls up to Leitrim area. Starts with C, is it? Can't think of it now. But anyway, this was a feature of the Blessington area where people came from Dublin too. Now, they didn't only come to see the water, they also came because of the drinking, right? Because of the fact when you travelled outside Dublin and you were outside 3 miles, you were able to have a drink in what's called a bona fide pub, right? Okay? And a lot of the Dubliners would have come for the purpose maybe of looking at that, quote unquote, and then heading for the pub, right? And there were a number of instances of people who were killed off the tram because of drinking, right? Either falling off the tram or falling under the tram itself, right? So drink did have its effect, not only here, but else throughout the actual length and breadth of Tyrrell to Blessington and Poulafuka, because that is known as the longest graveyard in Ireland, right? Because if you go, all the memory stones are not there, but the number of people who were killed by the tram, you know, coming through from Tyrrell out to Blessington, not to Poulafuka, it says it's called the longest graveyard in Ireland itself. But this is the beautiful. Now, I was up there, I was with a friend of mine recently, about a year ago, and the next thing was, in fact, I heard a thunder. Because this here is what's called the Nemo Bridge. Nemo was a famous Scottish engineer who built bridges and harbours throughout the country. But I heard the thunder of the water coming down. It was just phenomenal. And here you have, in fact, people there out visiting, right? You know, there's a bit of finery there involved, as you can see. You know, I mean, this isn't slapdash haberdashery. This is real stuff. You know, a nice three-piece suit, nice bit of fur, lovely hat, right? So people came here for the purpose of visiting the actual thing. So when people come to places, what do? They spend money. And that would have been a source of income for that area, and possibly for the Blessington area. I mean, people could have stopped off in Blessington and then went on to Poulafuka, or coming back from Poulafuka, stopped off in Blessington. And again, that's gone. And here you have, in fact, this is Jack Gagan, right? This is him here, there, okay? Now, Jack Gagan was the man, the guy with the big hammer, right? And he's here with American relatives at Poulafuka Falls, right? Jack Gagan worked for Hornages at Russellstown House, and that's where that was about. So as you can see on the Sunday, they came along, and look at the vision of the actual thing, and there was a small little seating area there. Now I've snuck down there. There's a big thing on the gate says, no trespassing. Anyway, you know yourself, the child within you says what? You know? So we went down anyway, and as I said, we found this little spot here, which of course you're not allowed down there for the obvious reasons, dangers attached to it. But it always fascinated me that we've never done anything with it, right? In terms of, now the problem is of course that the falls aren't there as they are now because of the actual dam itself, right? So now tourism, so we've got the communities, we've got the farming, right? We've got the landscape, right? We've got the religious, and then we've got the tourism. So as you can see, the actual effect of the flooding of this valley has had a major influence on what's happening in the actual upper reaches of the Liffey Valley and the surrounding townlands. The construction of the dam itself, right, is 100 feet high, right, or 30 metres, right. Now that's a sizable amount of, you know, I mean, I put both of them in because most of them are thinking about feet. I think about feet all the time as opposed to metres. But I mean 100 feet high. In 1937, November, construction work on the dam began. 1937. A village to cater for the housing of 200 was constructed near the dam. That's the amount of people who were working on the dam itself, right? So there was a housing for those people. Now there probably were billets, right? They weren't houses per se, like big army billets, right? Where maybe 20, 30 to a billet slept together, right? Now there were other accommodations for the actual engineers and the architects and those people, right? Again, a little bit above the notch, you had to go somewhere else. But that's the number of people who were there. Now, I do believe, and having spoken to one or two people who were aware of it, that the amount of people in guest houses in the Blessington area was just phenomenal. That people made loads and loads of money from it, right? Now, one can say, in fact, that's the sort of, I suppose, the benefit of the dam being built against some of the disadvantages of it. And then in 1940, and this is, I like this bit, at 10 a.m. on the 3rd of March, the sluice gate, the River Liffey, was closed, right? And what they did with the dam was, in fact, the following, right? They built it from both sides, right, to the middle. And then the sluice gate in the middle, right? And the River Liffey, the Liffey, which is a combination of the two rivers, right? They would have, the thing went down, right? The water went down. But when they came to the actual middle of it, they had the sluice gate there, and they closed the sluice gate itself. And that was on the 3rd, that was 1940. And my belief is, in fact, and anybody can contradict me, I believe it took 2 years for the actual lake, for the upper valley to actually fill up altogether, right? Okay? Now you can see the consequences of it, right? And that brings me down to there's some pictures, right? This here is the road as you would know it now, right? This is the dam being built from both sides, down at Poulafuka, right? And this is the Liffey coming down through the gap there, which is the sluice gate being opened, right? So it was allowed to come down. And here is, in fact, again, another picture, right? And some of this is probably the engineers' offices and so on. I don't have a picture of anything else. And then compensation. This is the emotive part, right? Okay? Because let's think about it, right? I mean, one of the problems was the fact it was a big, big issue. It was a big issue because of the fact that when the actual figures were being established, right, that the economic valuation of the farms was set at the time of 1939, when the world was in depression, as opposed to being set in 1926, when the land was sizable in terms of values, right? So what they did, and it wasn't the ESB, and I'll come back to that now in a second, right? It was the government who set that particular figure. And therefore people felt that what they did in fact was they were being robbed of the land in terms of the values they were given against the values they knew there was, right? They were being compensated, one, for the piece of land, right? Possibly if they had a house, they lost that, got compensation. But what about the social dimensions? What about the idea of the culture? What about the idea of the bog? What about the idea of the friendships that were there? There was no compensation. You wouldn't get away with it today in any manner, shape or form, right? So therefore, the other thing was that the values they were given on the lands, right, or the farms, was way inadequate for the purpose of buying farms elsewhere, right? So therefore, you have 60 acres, you've lost 30 because of the flooding, right? You're left with 30, not viable. So you think we're going to move. But when they give you the actual value of it, you think, hold on, that's not going to buy your farm anywhere. Now some people moved to Donaghey, some went to Dunlavin in different parts throughout the Kildare area itself, right? So what happens, of course, is the fact that they're not getting adequate compensation. Now, they didn't sort of take it lying down, because there was loads of protest meetings, and there was loads of representation, right, by the local TDs to the government itself. And they are very well recorded in this here, right, saying very clearly the nature of the debates. And I have to say, give it to the actual TDs from Wicklow, and this part, West Wicklow, they really made very, very strong cases for the purpose of it. Which brings me to the idea of the valuation. And this is where we have to be careful, right? The tail has been pinned on the donkey, but the donkey everybody thought was in fact the ESB. The donkey was not the ESB, the donkey was in fact the government. Because the government had determined what the values were, not the ESB. The ESB were carrying out what they were told to do, right? And they had CPOs, compulsive purchase orders, right? And they were saying, this is the value. Now, just because, you go into a shop and you say to a fellow, what's the price? And he says, it's £5. Well, you don't attack him, do you? Because him or her is just simply saying the price. You have to say, where's the owner? I want to talk to the owner about the price of this. Same thing with the actual valuations. So as I said, the tail was pinned on the wrong donkey, right? And that's not to exonerate the ESB, because over the years they've neglected a lot of things attached to what the lake is about. In particular, the maintenance of the bridges. We won't go there yet, right? So therefore, in that sense, you have, in fact, the valuation of farm. The purchase of new farms, that's where they couldn't buy them against the values they had or the monies they got for the actual land they had. The loss of natural resources. Well, first and foremost, there was a Liffey, and there was, in fact, the Kings River, right? Well, what you're going to find in that is that's water, right? For land, for cattle, right? Also has fish, right? Which people could get. Then you had the bog, right? And that was a process of fuel for the winter, right? So there's a number of, apart from the fact of the beauty and the scenery of it, right? And then, of course, the whole idea of the disturbing from, where you lived for hundreds of years, and not you, but your family and the generations of your family have now been taken away. So really it was very sort of, what's the word I'd be thinking about? That sense of the product, right? Piece of land, there's a value. What about, no, what about, no, none of those things we're taking. We're not taking the social, we're not taking the natural resource, we're not taking anything into consideration. We're not talking about the sentimental value of anything. We're giving you the price of the land, which in fact is at 1939 prices, not in 1926 prices, which is usually what the case is about. And that was a major, major bone of contention. And I know that having talked to people and having read one or two articles, there's still a feeling, within the community, not everywhere, but some people have that sense of which, in fact, that is what they did, right? Now, I've heard it mentioned that this greenway is being told it's been one of the things where Wicklow County Council are imposing something on the people of the actual lakeside, right? And they're saying it could be of the same nature of what happened in 1939. That's for another day's debate. And then social valuation of land, right? So the compensation was a very, very sore point. And I think people, I won't say they would have moved very willingly, but they could have moved more comfortably if in fact they feel they had got some justice. Now you could challenge it, right? Why couldn't you? But the problem was, in fact, there were three options, wasn't there? When you challenged it, right, you had to have a solicitor. Two, you could get the same price that you got before. You could get less than you got before, or you could get more. Whichever way it worked, when the solicitor was finished, you got nothing. That's what it came down to, right? Because they're I hope there's no solicitors in the building, is there? Right? That's I see everybody smiling, I'm okay, you know. When I see the fellow with his face, anyway, the woman or man with his face, you go, oh, jeez, I crossed that line too much. But anyway, it is true, right? There is, in fact, a cost attached to the idea of having legal advice as part of it. And, hold on, we've come a long way, right? And here is, in fact, the lesson next day, right? As you know it, right? The different townlands around it, right? And, you know, it does and it has brought some benefits in the modern day, right? Because the amount of people that are coming to Blessington and the possibility of having a walkway around it is possibly there in the future, right? But there's a few bridges, there's more than a few bridges across, right? But at the end of the day, it is beautiful. And Mick mentioned this particular monument here, and that's the monument, right? That's the monument out there in the grounds of the priest house in Ballymount, right? And here, in fact, are all the townlands that were affected, right? And this tells you here, right? It's called the Garden of Remembrance, right? And again, it's the less people forget, you know? And people do forget. And people moving in don't know, right? Now you know, right? A little bit more maybe than you did before. And I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything to add to what I've said, but there's a story in every one of those slides. I could leave a presentation on nearly every one of them alone, right? So what I want to do is give a broad scope of what was affected by the flooding of the lake itself, and the valley itself, right? And to recognise the fact, everybody talks about Ballynahown as being the only thing affected. It wasn't the only one affected. We showed you all the townlands that were affected, right? And that's where the 76, when I saw 76 houses originally, I thought, geez, this Ballynahown place must be in some spot, you know? Until I read further into it to discover, in fact, there were 76 houses attached to all the actual townlands, and then 55 farms. I said, that was someplace, but it wasn't, right? But at the same time, that's the only village, the only townland village that was fully and completely flooded as part of what happened, right? Now, the other question here is, in fact, why, right? There had been, in fact, and I'll go back a bit here, right? Okay, go back a fair bit, I think. Let me go back here. Fair play to you, there we go. There we can be honest. Am I missing a slide?
Second.
I'm missing a slide. Unfortunately.
Next one, I think it is.
No, it's not. It's not. The actual, that's what I didn't deal with. The slide is to do with the fact that in 1919, the British government had commissioned a survey about the prospect of having the valley being flooded, right? Because they could see, in fact, the population was growing all the time, and therefore they needed to think in terms of what were they going to do by way of electricity, by way of water, right? But of course, that never came to pass, right? And then, of course, there was the other one, which was the Shannon scheme, which was Ardnacrusha, right? Ardnacrusha, of course, as you know, is in the Limerick area, right? And that was the one that got priority over Blessington at the time, right? Okay? And I'll come back to that in a second. But then, actually, as they went through, they realised the thought was to bring the water from the Shannon through Leinster and into Dublin, with reservoirs all the way along, right? That was initially the thinking. But the cost of doing it was astronomical. The technology in terms of machinery wasn't there for the purpose of achieving that. So what they did come up with was, in fact, the Liffey scheme, right? And the idea of doing what they did, which was flooding, right? Now, I was talking about this recently, and somebody said, in fact, do you know that Sean Keating, does anybody know who Sean Keating is? Famous Irish painter, right? Who has done some great sceneries. And he did a lot of painting of Ardna Crusher, because he was trying to sort of recognise or memorise the whole idea of what was happening in the country at the time, because Ireland now was in fact trying to become a modern state. He did some paintings, which I'm told I can't find, to do with Pulafuka, right? The other thing about Pulafuka was, right, I do a little bit of Joycean work, James Joyce, right? And in Ulysses, there is in fact a trip by Bloom from Tyrrell, because he was in the school in Tyrrell, the high school, right? Now, don't forget this is all fictional, right? So he takes the actual tram out with the school trip to Pulafuka. So that's the mention of Pulafuka in both Ulysses and in Gilligan's Wake, right? Any questions, ladies and gentlemen, because that's the end of the presentation.